So this first image here, these are just a variety of the squirrel mops that I have. Now these squirrel mops range from, this is kind of a gigantic one here, this Gene Haynes squirrel mop. And I do like, you can see the difference on some of these between the shape of the brush and how it enters the handle of the brush, the ferrule. Some of them go a little bit wider as they come out of the ferrule like this, and some of them just taper. So these kinds of brushes like this are, even though they're big and bulky, they're a little bit more controlling. The shape of it is, so it's a huge brush, but it's not quite as floppy as some of these that might stick out and hang outside of the brush a little bit more. This Escoda Aquario brush here is a really nice one. One of the things about these brushes is the size of them. People always ask, what size are these brushes that you use? And when it comes to squirrel mops, like a squirrel mop size 8 is hugely different from a sable brush size 8, which would be about a third of that size. So, and some of them don't even have those kinds of sizes. This is one of the silver brushes that I use. And when they have their larger squirrel mops, they don't even have a number on it. They just say either LG or MD, I think, for like large and medium. So you want to pay attention to them, just get a couple, different varieties of them. But this is one that I got in Italy when I was there. It's a really nice brush. The handle, the grip on the handle is kind of, it's got a texture to it, so it feels good in your hand. And this Princeton Neptune, this is one that I recommend to people quite a bit. They're not very expensive. They're nice, really nice squirrel mops. So again, just kind of using find what best suits you. I do kind of like it when they come to a nice point. I love this Tintoretto size 6 brush. I love that point that you get from it. So you can go from painting a nice big shape. Same thing with the Unico one, by the way, too. You go from painting a really big shape to a smaller one without having to switch brushes. I think all of these are actually 100% squirrel. I'm not positive on that, so don't quote me, but I think these are all squirrel, except the synthetic, the silver brush is kind of a blend of squirrel and synthetic. And again, maybe some of these are, I don't actually know, but I know for a fact that these are. So these kind of have a little bit more control on that, and that'll come up later on when I'm doing my initial washes. So that's how I start my painting, with those big squirrel mops. Then I switch, there's some of these smaller, these are actually squirrel hair brushes too, so they're natural brushes, but much smaller than the big mop brushes. And these are kind of fun too. They have a little less control, again, than the sable type brushes. They're a little bit looser, a little bit floppier, and again, you can kind of tell by that shape as it comes out of the ferrule, it bulges out a little bit. So it's kind of fun to paint with these, and yet they still have, because they're size 0 or size 2, they do have a nice little point on them. So I usually, in the middle of that first light wash, if I'm going to come back in and do some, small details while it's still drying and I want to keep it loose and wet, instead of going to a controlling kind of a sable type brush, I'll stick with this little squirrel brush and just kind of put in some loose details so I don't get too tight with it. And then after that, after that first wash is dried, then when it's time to do the big middle value shape, that's when I'm going to switch to more of a sable type brush. Okay, so it's still a natural hair brush. Some of these aren't pure sable, like this Cheap Joe's is a pseudo sable, so it acts like a sable brush, but it actually is a little bit more stiff and controlling. Whereas some of the other kind of true sable brushes, natural hair ones, are a little bit softer. So, but that's kind of the typical size 12 or size 14, big enough brush to be able to paint a large shape, but still a nice point to be able to control the edges a little bit. So again, that's for that next stage, that middle value shape, where I can just kind of keep reloading up a size 14 or 12 sable type brush and work from a wet edge, keep joining my shapes, but yet have a nice point for control. And then these synthetic, more synthetic type brushes. The Escoda Perla is probably the most well-known one. That's what Joseph Zbukovic and Alvaro and all those guys have used and promoted quite a bit. So everybody's familiar with those. Excellent brushes. They have those white tips on them. They don't stay white very long. After a painting or two, they're pretty much gray after that. But the really, really well-made brushes. I like the control you get with those. This is another synthetic type of a brush here, this Da Vinci kind of spin synthetic, they call it. Again, you can just tell by the shape of the top of it that it's not going to be as stiff and controlling as the small little sharp head on the Escoda Perla, right? So like, sometimes I don't want to be too precise with the shapes. If I'm painting little animals or figures or something, I'm going to use this. If I'm maybe working with something where I want a smaller shape, but I don't need quite as much control, maybe I'll use one of these two brushes. This one is actually this Princeton Aqua Elite, has a nice shape brush to it, similar to the Escoda brush, where it's a little bit more controlling. And then I have just kind of a variety of these Chinese calligraphy type brushes, and they're nice for natural shapes, okay, because they're not true watercolor brushes. I'm not even sure what they're made of. I think it's goat hair, or maybe even some of them are, I don't think they're synthetic. I'm not sure. This one kind of looks like it's more of a synthetic one. But the bristles on these brushes are not as nearly as fine and soft as like a squirrel hair brush or a sable type brush. Much more of a rough feeling to them when you're using them. So I like to use these when I'm scrubbing in foliage and brushes, brush and grasses and things, just to kind of push them around. And it forces you to not have too controlled of a shape, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Those nicer brushes, you find yourself trying to paint the actual grasses or paint the foliage, and as much as you try and make it look natural and loose and random, it becomes controlled somehow. So if you can get one of these cheaper brushes and just kind of push it around on your paper, that works very nicely. And then lastly, these two little brushes, I like to have a small synthetic just for fine detail, maybe some of the little power lines or tiny little barbed wire fences, or some of the, again, smaller details, fence posts or something. And this is the brush that I use to sign my paintings with also, by the way, just a small little number 2. And then I like to have a small oil brush actually as well that I can use to lift out small highlights if I want to. If I want to stay away from using gouache at all, I want to stick to all transparent watercolor, which most of the time I don't really care. But if I finished a whole painting and I managed to get it, paint around all my lights, and it's without using gouache, and I think, maybe this is, if there's something that requires everything be 100% transparent, instead of coming in with gouache, I can take a stiff little oil brush. And because it's short and stiff, you can get that wet and just kind of scrub out highlights a little bit better than you can with a longer, softer watercolor brush. So I usually just have a small little Robert Simmons series oil brush with me too. And that's about it. So I know that's a lot of brushes, but squirrel mops, big ones and smaller ones, the sable type brushes for that middle value kind of connected shape, synthetics for more detail, the Chinese calligraphy brushes for random tree foliage and grasses, and then these two little guys. So I'll just kind of walk you through just a quick painting that I did of this scene. I didn't really finish the whole thing, but I just want to kind of show you the examples and how I would use them when I start things off, and just walk you through it. So again, that first, after I sketch it all out, big Princeton Neptune squirrel mop brush. I'm going to paint the clouds in that sky, this gray color, okay? I wet my paper first. Not worried about controlling anything, okay? So these brushes are big, floppy, hold a lot of water, and I just use those to knock in my big shapes, wet into wet, okay? So I'm starting with the squirrel mops. And then after I get the clouds themselves in, then I want to come in and maybe put in the blue of the sky. But those squirrel mops hold so much water, if I come in there with a really wet brush after I painted the clouds, it might fuzz a bit too much. Okay, so after I've knocked that in, then maybe I'll switch to that silver black velvet brush. It's still kind of a squirrel mop brush, but it's a little bit smaller, and it has a bit more control because of that synthetic blend. So I can come in with that brush and put in that blue sky, still big and loose, okay, but a little bit more control with it, and hopefully it doesn't, fuzz too much into my clouds. And again, so these big squirrel mops here. So I used these two here, the Princeton Neptune initially, and then this guy to put in the blues, okay? And then afterwards, maybe, you know, something like this little Tintoretto size 6. If I want to come in and do a little bit more work in some of those areas, you know, start knocking in some of the light grasses that you see. So that's a nice brush for that. Again, not a whole lot of control with it, but just a little bit more paint. When I'm mixing it, there's a bit more paint in here than there was for that watery thing there. I don't want it to bloom too much. I want it to stay soft. So I'm going to have to come back and repaint those grasses. But again, just knocking things in a little bit with some of those smaller mop brushes. Again, then maybe I would switch before it's dry to the even smaller mop or squirrel type brushes, okay? The size 0 or size 2 little squirrel mops. Tintoretto, Da Vinci, Raphael, you know, there's a bunch of them that have these little kind of natural squirrel brushes. You just do your research on your own. But these are the ones that I have, okay? And again, kind of coming back, thicker paint still with one of those and dropping in maybe just a little bit more darker areas. I put in that little shadow of the snow there. So again, this is all, the paper is still damp at this point. I'm not worried about painting a real controlled shape, just trying to get some nice local tones on here. Everything that I want to stay soft. That's when I'm using the large squirrel mops and the smaller squirrel brushes. Then I'm going to let that dry and switch to these guys. Okay, for the middle value wash, or that big shape, I'm going to use the sable type brush. Big enough, size 12 or 14, so that I'm painting that big shape, but I have more control with these than with the squirrel mop, so I can, you know, now I'm starting to paint some defined shapes, the shape of the barn, the shape of the silos, you know, even some of the cows and things. So I don't want it to be too loose and floppy. So these sable type brushes give me a bit more control. And this is, you get your palette looking like this initially, all right? Big puddles, brown, blue, red, gray, neutral tint, whatever. Nice big puddles of paint on your palette, all right? So now my paper is dry. Again, I let that first wash dry. So now I'm able to just connect and go from that blue, switch to the neutral tint and gray in the silo, come back, switch back to the blue, more snow shadows, come back in with the red. Okay, load that up, go right from those blues and neutral tints into the red, connect, reload my brush, go back into neutral tint and brown maybe, back into the red, rinse it off, dry it off, grab the blue, put that in, okay, rinse and add some of the neutral tint in. So that whole connected shape, that whole process that I talk about with value studies and doing that, that's why it's so important to stick to doing those value studies. You're replicating that process, only instead of just going with Payne's Gray all the way across, now you're using those big puddles that you mixed, okay? And just keep changing the color in your brush, but you're still painting that shape. But yet the point on those sable type brushes allows you to do some of this little stuff, okay, without switching the brush in your hand. You can go from painting a nice big shape to a little smaller shape without changing the brush. Continuing across, again, I can even use that brush to paint smaller little shadows, but when you look at this shape, all those color shifts and stuff, that's my middle value shape that I'm working my way across. Whoops, that was backwards a little bit there. Okay, so that's kind of the finished middle value shape of my painting. And again, just connections as much as I can. I think I actually came back in and connected this cow after the fact, put a little bit of a tone on that one. But you can see what I'm talking about there. So that's that whole, the first two big shapes. Okay, now it's time to work on some more details. After that's starting to dry, some smaller shapes. And now I'm going to switch to the synthetic brushes. And again, that Escoda is a nice one. The little Da Vinci Spin Synthetic, those are two of my favorite brushes. So I'll come in with that Escoda brush. You can already see after mixing my brown, the white is gone. But getting in a little bit more paint still, darker paint. Nice fine point on it. Okay, synthetic brush, more control for smaller things. So now I'm coming in with using that for painting little cows. More cow shapes, okay? I can start to define more. So the brush that you use, I keep getting smaller and stiffer for the details. Even the little fence post, dry brushing some small fence posts into it, okay? So that's when I'm using mostly my little Escoda synthetic brush. All right, and but sometimes I might want to switch to a little larger, softer one, okay, once I don't need quite as much control. So now I'm using this one over here, that size 10 Princeton Aqua Elite. And I needed to tint down the side of that barn just a little bit. The whole thing had kind of a light side, shadow side. So instead of using a stiff little synthetic brush for that, I switched to a little bit larger one, a little bit softer one, still nice control because I wanted to paint that shape in between the back of that trailer. But now I'm tinting the back of the barn a little bit, darkening it up, giving it some form. Okay, still kind of drawing with a smaller brush, painting that little shadow shape. All right, so that kind of finishes off with those smaller synthetic type brushes. Then those grasses in the front. Okay, so now maybe I want to switch to those little calligraphy brushes and a little less control. Get thicker paint in there, just some raw sienna, burnt sienna, neutral tint, whatever, and just push that around. And again, because they're not natural, fine watercolor brushes, you get more of a just kind of a scratchy, looser mark with it that works really well for grass and foliage. So that's what I use those little calligraphy brushes for. And then last but not least, like I said, those final two smaller things that I might need to use. The little stiff synthetic brush, that's a point, and then my that little oil painting brush. So now I need to come in with that little guy and paint some fences and things, just tiny things. I might be able to do that with that Escoda brush, but you're running the risk of getting a bit too large with that. So I switched to that smaller brush for those. And more fence posts, okay, just the little guys, little things. I probably used it for some of the legs and stuff on the cows as well. Then I'm going to use that stiff oil brush to maybe lift off a little highlight here on the edge of that barn. Instead of coming in with gouache or trying to paint around it earlier, I can get a nice, softer, less obtrusive light shape by just kind of lifting it. When I use this brush, by the way, what you do is get it wet and just kind of go over this a couple times stiff, wipe it off, go over it a couple times again, wipe it off, and then I take a paper towel and just blot that area and lift it off. So I soften it with that little brush. Soft little highlight in the snowdrift. Everything was hard-edged and crisp because I waited, to paint that middle value shadow shape. And but maybe you want some little softer snow areas, so I can do that with a stiff little oil brush too. That works fine. And then I use that smaller pointy brush to sign my paintings with. And that wraps it all up. So there you have it. Just kind of a demonstration, walking your way through the different stages of each painting and the brush that I use. So hopefully that clarifies things a little bit. And again, just like anything else, the paper you use, the paint you use, the brushes you use, it's a very personal choice. But I try and have a nice variety, figure out what I like. I usually have, my favorite one or two from each section that I tend to stick with, but just thought I would show you those. So, all right, happy painting, everyone. Hi, my name's Andy Evansen. Over the course of this year, I'll be discussing a lot of ways to improve your paintings with a focus on watercolor in particular. Watercolor is a popular medium, but there are technical issues that can become stumbling blocks during the learning process. The painting becomes a lot more fun once you've solved them and can start refining your craft. I'll cover topics that are unique to watercolor, such as painting wet and wet, the timing and consistency of your washes, the importance of drawing and negative shape making, and more. I'll also be talking a lot about how vital it is to have a plan. The transparent nature of watercolor means you're limited in the amount of fixing you can do once you've started, and indecisiveness, that's what leads to the weak, muddy paintings. Because this course spans a calendar year, you'll be able to see me painting outdoors on location as well as in the studio. We can talk about the differences and similarities of both. I've taught dozens of 3 to 5 day workshops, and most of the time, just as students are starting to figure things out, it's time to say goodbye. This course through Tucson Art Academy Online allows me to work with you for an entire year, so we'll be able to get into things that just aren't possible in a 4-day workshop. As an artist who also loves to teach, I'm really excited about the possibilities of this. I hope you'll join me.